right here by Cynthia Gordy, June 17th, 2011. Welfare, fathers, and those persistent myths. Welfare, fathers, and those persistent myths. Okay. So this goes through and dispels this myth about the Great Society programs, welfare, and Black men not being in the home, making it illegal for Black men to be in the home. We got this, and I got some other information to show you as well. So let's look at this quickly here and break this down. Welfare fathers and those persistent myths. Okay, so they talk about the movie Claudine from 1974, starring Diane Carroll and James Earl Jones. You know, the voice of Darth Vader, James Earl Jones, and Diane Carroll, Whitley Gilbert's mother on A Different World. All right, so we've all seen the movie Claudine, all right? And she's on welfare and she has a boyfriend, and the white social worker comes to the house and you can't have a man in the home, things like this, right? So they go on to say, urban legends tell of man in the house rules that prohibit men from living under the same roof as moms who receive public assistance. Between media images, half-truths, and also well-meaning but flawed policies, the belief that the welfare system undermines poor families has been entrenched in the public mind for decades. Now, what's interesting, I've heard people throw this myth out. Now, they don't provide any supporting evidence, no supporting documentation. They just throw it out and then people just accept it. Okay, so then they go on, they talk about the Fatherhood Initiative at public housing authorities nationwide, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, etc. If we go down here, let's see, continue reading. I want to go to the section, clearing up misconceptions. Let me scroll down right here, clearing up misconceptions. A particular fact that those giving the side eye to the American welfare system often trot out is that in 1890, married couples headed 80% of all Black households. Married couples headed 80% of all Black households. And you hear a lot of Black conservatives throw this statistic out. Okay, now, yes, times were totally different. I mean, you're talking about 35 years after chattel slavery in 1890. Okay, and I'm an advocate for marriage. I'm an advocate for healthy marriages, not crazy marriages, not dysfunctional marriages. The figure held constant over the next 7 decades through 1960. However, by 1970, after President Lyndon Baines Johnson established social reforms like WIC, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children, food stamps, Medicaid, and public housing projects, Black families with mothers and fathers at home had fallen to 64%. Now, we're going to look at the history of WIC, because the WIC legislation actually is in 1972. Is proposed in 1969 under the and that would be under the Richard Nixon administration. Okay, because, well, it's 69 under the Richard Nixon administration, because Nixon takes the oath of office January 20th, 1969. We know he runs in 1968 and wins. Lyndon Johnson does not run for re-election in 1968. Okay, so we're going to look at that. She talked about the welfare system starting in the 1950s. Then she said the welfare system, food stamps, all this stuff starts with Lyndon Johnson. Now, in all actuality, and I'm going to show you this, welfare began in 1935 under the Social Security Act of 1935 as part of the New Deal from President Franklin Roosevelt to fight against the Great Depression, because there were so many destitute white people. That's when welfare started. Okay, welfare didn't start with the Great Society programs. Okay, so we have to look at this. I'm going to show you that in just a minute, because I'm a historian. So Proper documentation ends all conversation. I understand history. I can provide you with the evidence. I'm listening to Candace Owens. I can tell she does not understand history. And that's why when you listen to her, usually, in like in these interviews, she doesn't provide any underlying documentation. She doesn't provide any evidence, anything like that. She just throws out Tex Lyndon Johnson and, you know, different things like that. No evidence. All right. So let's continue here. Black two-parent homes continue to plummet over the next 20 years, hitting 38% in 1990. Okay, so African-American two-parent homes, 38% in 1990. 1960 is like 80%, okay, headed by two parents. All right. Now, Andrew Billingsley, a sociologist acclaimed for his pioneering work tracing the African-American family, attributes the abrupt change in family structure not to welfare policies, but to rising unemployment. Not to welfare policies, but to rising unemployment. This is what he told TheRoot.com. Quote, what happened in the mid-1950s were technological changes that abolished unskilled jobs that most black men could do and created high-tech jobs they could not do. Okay. So, and even at this time in the 1950s, even though some of us are able to get into labor unions, there's still a lot of discrimination in the labor unions where a lot of us can't get into those. And it's also important to note that labor unions, these large labor unions that you're going to see, are largely going to start after chattel slavery ends, with the 13th Amendment being ratified and adopted December 18th, 1865. The 13th Amendment is adopted. 1866, you have the National Labor Union created. And then you're going to have these large labor unions created, and they were created largely to protect jobs for white men and to lock African-American men out of these jobs we have been doing for free for 246 years. Okay, because there were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. As long as we were, generally speaking, largely speaking, doing those jobs for free, it wasn't a problem. But now that we can compete for wages, and then in 1866, you have the Republicans in Congress who passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And the Civil Rights Act of 1866 allows African Americans to enter into labor contracts, things of this nature, so we can get better wages, compete for wages, etc. Now you want to lock us out of those jobs that we have been doing for free. Okay, so there is a in my classes that I teach, especially the one dealing with the transatlantic slave trade, ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. I show this slide here. Let me bring this up. I show this slide here, and let's go to this. Let's go to the PowerPoint presentation. Here's a resource that you can look at. There were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. This comes from the book by James Newton and Ronald Lewis in 1978 called Crafts, Artisans, Skills. Called The Other Slaves, Mechanics, Artisans, and Craftsmen. Okay. And when you look at it, they go through and they list it in alphabetical order. All right. Now, we were anchor makers, artists, bakers, barrel makers, bartenders, basket makers, beer makers, blacksmiths, cigar makers, cooks, coppersmiths, blacksmiths, hunters, hemp baggers, gardeners, engineers, etc. Okay, you get the idea. You can go research this, and there are other lists like this as well. So when you have these large labor unions being created in the American Federation of Labor, 1875, things like this, right? They're locking us out of these jobs that we have been doing for free for basically 246 years, or largely for free for 246 years. Okay, let's go back to this article here from theroot.com. All right, now, so yeah, the mid 1950s and technological changes. All right. So sociologist Andrew Billingsley told The Root, explaining that the advent of efficient goods producing machines drove millions of black men out of the stable blue collar workforce. Quote, that's what kept black families from getting and staying married, not the welfare system. To say otherwise is a misunderstanding of the data and a misreading of history. Now, you've heard me say a number of times, if you watch me here on the African History Network show, or you see me on Roland Martin Unfiltered, because I'm on Roland Martin Unfiltered every Friday. Been on every Friday since October 2020. I'm not just a historian, I'm also a national political commentator. Your understanding of politics is directly related to your understanding of history. Your understanding of politics is directly related to your understanding of history. I can tell Candace Owens does not understand history. I've said this before. I've also said Charlemagne the God does not understand politics or history either. He does not. Okay, I said this back in 2020. Okay, as well as Charlemagne the God. He does not understand history. He does not understand politics. I said this back in 2016 as well. And everything I said is true. It's proven to be true. Okay, let's continue. Now, Andrew Billingsley, sociologist Andrew Billingsley, I'll come to his next statement here. But on the subject of common misconceptions about public assistance, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Housing and Urban Development, would like to clarify that there is no public housing eligibility requirement that excludes couples. Some states used to apply such regulations, but check this out. This is what the black conservatives, most of them, are not going to tell you, especially Candace Owens. But the Supreme Court struck those down in 1968. Have any of these black conservatives told you this? The Supreme Court struck this down in 1968. Quote, the notion that we have rules prohibiting fathers from living in the home is simply not true, end quote, said Sims, who added that the agency does take income levels into consideration, quote, but if two parents are working and don't qualify, we have a significant supply of other affordable housing programs around the country for them. Now, this article is from 2011, okay? I want to focus on Supreme Court 1968, because there was a Supreme Court case in 1968 of King versus Smith. King versus Smith. Let's take a look at that. Okay. Well, so, you know, some people may ask the question, well, Michael Imhotep, I never heard of the Supreme Court case of King versus Smith. Well, I'm glad you asked that question. That's a very good question. Let's take a look at this. So I want to look at this entry from encyclopedia.com dealing with man in the house rule. Man in the house rule. And this comes from West Encyclopedia of American Law. West, W-E-S-T''S, West Encyclopedia of American Law. Okay, man in the house rule. Okay, and encyclopedia.com has gives you access to all these online encyclopedias so you can do research. Okay, man in the house rule, a regulation that was formally applied in certain jurisdictions that denied poor families welfare payments in the event that a man resided under the same roof with them. Okay, but that was state law. Okay, that wasn't something that President Johnson instituted. That was applied at some state levels. Under the man in the house rule, a child who otherwise qualified for welfare benefits was denied those benefits if the child's mother was living with or having relations with any single or married able-bodied male. The man was considered a substitute father, even if the man was not supporting the child. Before 1968, administrative agencies in many states created and enforced the man in the house rule. Okay, in many states, not federal law, but at the state level. In 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the regulation as being contrary to the legislative goals of the Aid to Families of Dependent Children, known as AFDC. The AFDC program established by what? The Social Security Act of 1935. Now, why didn't Candace Owens tell you that it was President Roosevelt who created the Social Security, who created welfare? Because AFDC was part of the Social Security Act. We're going to look at the Social Security Act in 1935 in just a minute. Okay, I'm a historian. All right, so I ain't one of these sensationalist people. You know, you got everybody has do a podcast. I started doing podcasts in 2010 before people even knew what the hell it was. Okay, I was doing blog talk radio before people knew what blog talk radio was. I've done nationally syndicated radio. I've done traditional terrestrial radio with an FCC license for 7 years here in Detroit, 910 AM WFDF. Then on WCHB 1200 AM with my frat brother Angelo Henderson. I did a recurring segment on his show for a year. So I've been in radio 14 years. Okay, I still do podcasts, but I was doing that before anybody knew what it was. So, and I'm a historian, so the type of information you're going to get from me is a whole lot different than what you're going to get from a lot of these sources out here. So the AFDC program established by the Social Security Act of 1935, Candace Owens didn't tell you that, provides benefits to the children of impoverished parents. In the U.S. Supreme Court case of King versus Smith, 1968, King versus Smith, 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court entertained a challenge to the man in the house rule brought by the 4 children of Miss Sylvester Smith, who was a widow. The children were denied benefits by Dallas County, Alabama, welfare authorities based on their knowledge that a man named Williams was visiting Miss Smith on weekends and had sexual relations with her. Okay. Now, the children of Miss Smith filed a class action suit in federal court on behalf of other children in Alabama who were denied benefits under Alabama's, quote, substitute father regulation. This regulation considered a man a substitute father if, one, he lived in the home with the mother, two, if he visited the mother frequently for the purpose of living with the mother, 3, if he cohabitated with the mother elsewhere. Now, King cited Alabama Manual for Administration of Public Assistance. Testimony in the case revealed that there was some confusion among the authorities over how to interpret the regulation. Okay, there was some confusion by the authorities on how to interpret the regulation. One official testified that the regulation applied only if parties had sex at least once a week. Another official testified that sex every 3 months was sufficient. Now, I don't know how they're going to determine how often the woman is having sex. I don't know if they're giving pelvic exams or what back in 1968. I don't know, but this was state law. Okay. Just crazy. All right. But only if the parties had sex at least once a week. Another official testified that sex every 3 months was sufficient. And still another official placed the frequency of sex at once every 6 months. Now, okay, I'm gonna leave that alone. I'm gonna leave that alone. Okay. Now, according to the High Court, Congress did not intend that the AFDC program required children, quote, to look for their food to a man who is not in the least obliged to support them, end quote. The court maintained that when Congress used the term parent in the Social Security Act of 1935, it was referring to, quote, an individual who owed the child a state-imposed legal duty of support. An individual who owed the child a state-imposed legal duty of support. Ultimately, the court struck down the man in the house rule. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down the man in the house rule by holding that under the FDC provisions in the Social Security Act, quote, destitute children who are legally fatherless cannot be flatly denied federally funded assistance on the transparent fiction that they have a substitute father, end quote. So why aren't these black conservatives out here who are supposed to be black conservatives / grifters / MAGA nuts, who are supposed to be for law and order and family values? Why aren't they telling us about this U.S. Supreme Court case from 1968? Why didn't Candace Owens mention this? This is the type of BS I'm talking about, because these people know better. These people know better, but they will consistently lie. And you have people like Charlamagne the God and DJ Envy that just let her sit her ass up there and just tell these lies and not challenge her on this. You don't have any producers. I've been on radio shows. You don't have any producers that fact check live time and say, hey, wait a second, she told 22 lies. We need to clear this stuff up before we let her get off the air. What are you doing? Okay, so read that from Man in the House Rule, encyclopedia.com. Read about that 1968 U.S. Supreme Court case. Okay, now let's go back to, do I have any more in that article from the Root? Okay, and also this piece from the Root. Let's go back to this very quickly because I got a bunch of articles to get through. I wanted to look very quickly here. Social Security Act of 1935, because that's where welfare starts. And that's largely for white people, especially white women. Okay, Supreme Court strikes it down 1968. Quote, the notion that, let's see, okay, we have rules. I got that. Okay, you can read this. It talks about another idea swirling around is that people convicted of crimes aren't eligible for public housing. Under the national policy, there are only 2 crimes for which we prohibit anyone from coming in, and that's if you sold methamphetamine or if you are a lifetime registered sex offender. Sims explained. Yet local authorities can set other standards, and some do bar applicants with records. Quote, our goal is family reunification. We've let local housing authorities know that we want that changed, end quote. Okay, so read the rest of this article here. It has a lot of good information here. This is why it's important to understand history. Your level of understanding of politics is directly related to your level of understanding of history, because the two are related. Okay, now we got that, and then there was, okay, so Andrew Billingsley in the piece from theroot.com talked about technological changes when it comes to jobs that abolish unskilled jobs that most black men do and created high-tech jobs that they could not do. All right, there's a history behind that. And if we look at this article here from InTheseTimes.com, we saw that happen here in the city of Detroit. And this surrounded the auto industry. This surrounded the auto industry. And let me find this article. Let me pull this up here. So this is a piece from 2013. And they cite Thomas Segru, professor, I think he's a political science professor, Thomas Segru, in his book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, which I read a lot of his book when we had the fake bankruptcy here in Detroit. He was cited all over the place when articles were written about this fake bankruptcy that the state of Michigan forced Detroit into. A half century after Detroit uprising, cities still stranded by capitalism and federal government. A half century after Detroit uprising, cities still stranded by capitalism and federal government. How federal policy and big auto drove black blight and white flight. Now, the original name of this article was Beyond the Myth of Black Misleadership. That was the original name of this article. Why they changed the name, I don't know. But I read this article originally when it came out in 2013. So I know what the original name was. And what they were saying is that when African-American mayors like Mayor Coleman Alexander Young and black mayors across the country, when they took over these cities, it was basically after white flight set in. And when they took these cities over, these cities were on life support. And then the black mayors get blamed for basically whatever went wrong in the city, even though, you know, there may be some things that they did wrong. But it's like, wait a second. They were given a city with declining resources, the city with a declining tax base, a city where you had white flight and you had infrastructure. You had factories being moved out of the inner city out to the suburbs. Okay. And this is what happened. Now, there's a part in here where they talk about the factories that I want to look at here. And they talk about the automation in the factories. That's what I want to focus on. Okay. So, okay, they say, so the nation still calls Detroit the Motor City. By the end of the 1950s, it was certainly not that. Big Auto dealt the first blow, flush with cash from World War II, because you got to understand what's called the arsenal of democracy. Okay. And President Roosevelt, even before the U.S. gets involved in fighting in World War II, when Pearl Harbor's attacked December 7, 1941, President Roosevelt says that the U.S. can be the arsenal of democracy and make military weapons for the Allied forces. Okay, so this is what happens, and this creates a lot of jobs even for African Americans. You have Executive Order 8802 that President Roosevelt is forced by A. Philip Randolph to put in place in June of 1941, because A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters threatens to put 100,000 African Americans marching on Washington to embarrass Roosevelt if Roosevelt doesn't desegregate these jobs in the Department of Defense so African Americans can get these jobs. This was going to be the first march on Washington. The day before the march was supposed to take place, President Roosevelt relinquishes and agrees to desegregate these jobs in the Department of Defense. So A. Philip Randolph calls off the first march on Washington. That was going to be in 1941. All right, now, flush with cash from World War II and anticipating a huge growth in demand for their products, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler abandoned Detroit's multi-story plants because the big three got lucrative contracts from the federal government to make military equipment. Abandoned in favor of new sprawling horizontal campuses on former farmland in the Detroit suburbs and in Ohio, Indiana, and Canada. Between 1947 and 1948, the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, as they were known back then, built 25 new factories, none of them in the city of Detroit. Okay. Taking at face value, this made sense as Detroit then lacked the land for the new horizontally integrated and automated plants. Yet, as historian Thomas Segru and others point out, it was a way for the auto companies to weaken the UAW, United Auto Workers Union, which had won unprecedented victories during the war years, World War II. And with the industry went jobs. With the auto industry went auto jobs. Not just with the big three, but also with suppliers of the big three. Okay. And African Americans were having a lot of these jobs, but when they move from inner cities, these factories out into the automated plants, automation eliminated a lot of entry-level jobs that our fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers had. Okay. When they moved up here from Mississippi and Tennessee and Alabama and Texas and Florida and all that, moving into Detroit, moving into Cleveland, moving into Gary, Indiana. In 1960, only Chrysler produced cars in the city of Detroit. is 60,000 Detroit workers, representing only half those employed just a decade earlier. In less than 2 decades, from 1947 to 1967, Detroit lost 128,000 jobs in the auto industry alone. Now, the jobs in the auto industry are there are other industries, the other businesses that rely on people having jobs in the auto industry so they can spend money with them. Okay. So when you talk about technology eliminating jobs, especially for African-American men, there's a history behind this. That is true. Okay, read the rest of this article. Then they go on and talk about in 1949, Congress passed the Federal Housing Act. Okay, for the first time, home ownership required only 3% down for attractive low interest rate mortgage. Okay, so and then we get into the GI Bill of 1945, 1946. And even though some African Americans who served in World War II can take advantage of those GI benefits that they earned, a lot of us were discriminated against. Okay, that's a whole nother conversation. All right, now. Okay, just give me a second here. Okay, so we dealt with that one from the root.com. We dealt with the man in house. We dispelled that nonsensical myth. All right, now let's look at this here. I want to look at the Social Security Act of 1935 because this is where welfare started. The Social Security Act of 1935. And then we look at the Great Society programs because the way Black conservatives and even white conservatives and Black conservatives take their talking points from white conservatives. Let's be clear on that. Black conservatives take their talking points from white conservatives. And this is why 99% of these Black conservatives will not admit that racism exists. And if you do find one, so Candace Owens said racism existed in the interview. But notice they never define what racism is, because racism is not a feeling. Racism is not calling people racial epithets or anything like that. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race, which comes out of the ideology of European white supremacy. This is what racism is. Racism is a power structure. Okay. Racism occurs when one race of people control the majority of the wealth, power, resources, privileges, benefits, land, access to education, access to opportunity, etc. And they use that to marginalize, subordinate, and do harm to another race of people. This is what racism is. That's the power structure. So then you have some people who say, well, racism exists, but systemic racism doesn't exist. Okay? Because they want to reduce racism to an individual level. They're confusing racism with bigotry. Bigotry is calling people racial epithets and racial slurs and hating people. That's not racism. Racism is a power structure. And racism is designed to preserve genetic white survival. So you have people like Senator Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina. And Senator Tim Scott, he attacked the Great Society programs. Senator Tim Scott was on in 2023 when he was running for president, his short-lived presidential campaign. That really didn't go anywhere. He was on The View, and he said that his personal success story proves that Democrats are lying about racism and proves systemic racism doesn't exist. The trick of Black conservatives. Now, let me say this from the start. I'm neither Democrat nor Republican, but I sure as hell ain't stupid. Okay. I'm a historian and national political commentator. I study politics. I can see whose policies overwhelmingly are more beneficial for African Americans, and I can see who keeps voting against those policies and keep blocking those policies. Like Senator Tim Scott was the one that blocked the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in the U.S. Senate. The only Black senator is the one who blocked the bill. Okay, so if you watch me here on the African History Network show, you see me on Roland Martin Unfiltered. You see me on any other shows that I've been on, numerous shows I've been on over the past few years. You know, I deal with facts and evidence. Read this article from thehill.com. Scott's comments on Great Society sparks debate on Black Americans, September 28th, 2023. And Senator Tim Scott, he parrots, you know, what Candace Owens says. They attack Lyndon Baines Johnson, Great Society programs, things like this. They talk about welfare. Now, they don't say like what caused the poverty. They don't ever want to have that discussion. They don't want to talk about 246 years of slavery, decades of Jim Crow segregation, being locked out of massive land giveaways like the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave away 270 million acres of land for 124 years. The U.S. government gave away land up until 1976. Up until 1976, from a policy from the second year of the Civil War. And African Americans were largely locked out of that. The Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which gave away something about 45 million acres of land. The Dawes Allotment Act of 1887, which gave away 138 million acres of land. We're largely locked out of these massive land giveaways. They don't want to have that type of conversation. Okay. All right. So read this piece here. And Johnson, what we had. So Tim Scott said, so often we think that all the issues you talk about, crime and education and healthcare, we always think that those issues go back to slavery. Here's the challenge, though. Black families survived slavery. We survived poll taxes and literacy tests. We survived discrimination being woven into the laws of our country. What was hard to survive was Johnson's Great Society, where they decided to put money, where they decided to take the black father out of the household to get a check in the mail. Now, I just disproved that. That's a damn lie. That's not what happened. And that was at the state level. That wasn't from President Johnson. Okay. So we just dealt with that. And the U.S. Supreme Court struck it down. Senator Tim Scott won't tell you. U.S. Supreme Court 1968 struck that down. And you can now measure that in unemployment and crime devastation. Now, little Timmy won't tell you that crime has dropped every year under the Biden-Harris administration. And in 2023, you had a record low unemployment rate for African Americans. It was under 6%. Okay. Since they have been tracking the unemployment rate by race since 1972. Tim Scott won't tell you that. Johnson's Great Society was a series of initiatives with goals including ending poverty, reducing crime, and eliminating inequality. It was the largest social reform plan in history, with investments into education, hospital care, and the expansion of Social Security. Social Security goes back to 1935. It also worked to enforce the 1964 Civil Rights Act, specifically removing barriers to voting. Okay. It's long been a target of voices on the right. I wonder why. Now, I find it interesting that Tim Scott is talking about crime, yet you're endorsing for president a man who's dealing with 88 criminal charges and who was found liable for rape in state court in New York. But Senator Tim Scott, you want to talk about crime. Donald Trump is the ultimate criminal. He ain't a smooth criminal like Michael Jackson said. He's the ultimate criminal. Let's go to our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Okay. There's a 10-week online history course called Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. I teach the class on Saturdays, 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our next classes are Saturday, March 9th, Saturday, March 16th, March 23rd, and March 30th. Okay. And then we have a few more classes after that. The class is on sale, $80, regularly $130. We do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded. You can go back and watch this anytime. So even after the course is over with, you can go back and watch the entire class. Okay. And we instead of 10 sessions, we're going to do at least 11, possibly 12. The course outline, the lesson plans for all 10 classes or 10 plus classes are laid out here. And I'll go through and update it periodically because we add a few additional subjects. But we take you through our history. We deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. So we deal with archaeological discovery that have come out in the last 10, 20. So we deal with Egypt on the Potomac and how the layout of Washington, D.C. is based upon ancient African principles coming out of ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. Kemet, one of the original names for Egypt, meaning land of the blacks. We look at the African origins of Star Wars and the Assyrian drama. There's an excerpt of an interview that I did with Professor Kaba Hiawatha Kamene, where we look at this information. We look at the Hannibal Barca and the Punic Wars, okay, and especially the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC. We look at Hannibal crossing the Alps, crossing the Pyrenees, 219 BC, but the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC. The Battle of Zama, 202 BC, where Hannibal Barca is defeated by Publius Cornelius Scipio. And Publius Cornelius Scipio takes the surname Africanus after he defeats Hannibal Barca at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Africa is not named after a Roman general. The Roman general took the surname Africanus after he defeated Hannibal Barca. And we know that Africanus is Latin, meaning belonging to Africa. It's Latin, meaning belonging to Africa. We look at the 800-year occupation of the Europes of the Africans known as the Moors, who take the teachings from the Nile Valley region of Africa into Europe. And this is going to bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. Okay. And we see the rise of Spanish conquest. We look at Christopher Columbus, and Columbus is essential to the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade and the exploitation of indigenous people and the exploitation of African people also. Okay. So we go through and look at this history chronologically. We also look at the fake Willie Lynch letter, 1712. Willie Lynch never historically existed. I wish we would just throw the Willie Lynch letter in the garbage can where it belongs. It's ahistorical. There are words in the Willie Lynch letter that didn't even exist in the early 1700s. Okay, the sentence structure, the syntax is not what they is not coming from England. That's 20th century sentence structure, and their words from the 20th century, from the industrial and the automotive industry, things like that, that are in that letter. That was written about 1970 by Dr. Kwabena Ashanti, who's come out and admitted he wrote the Willie Lynch letter, and is Professor Manu Ampim, who I'll be interviewing later this month, who exposed Dr. Kwabena Ashanti as the author of the Willie Lynch letter. It's a fraud. Dr. Kwabena Ashanti meant well, but I think it's done more harm than good. Okay, so you can register for that course at our website.